The car sat in the corner of the auction hall like something nobody had bothered to throw away yet. Dust covered the hood in a thin gray film. The paint had blistered and peeled along the fenders, and the handwritten lot tag dangling from the side mirror read $5,000 to $8,000, no reserve. Nobody stood near it. Nobody even glanced at it. And then Giselle Hartwell, the CEO of Hartwell Prestige Auctions, the most powerful name in high-end estate sales in New York, walked past it, looked down at the man crouching beside it with a small flashlight in his hand, and said 4 words that everyone in earshot heard clearly. Scrap metal, no value. The man in the worn work jacket didn't stand up. He didn't argue. He just kept looking at the undercarriage with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who already knew something the room did not. What did Lucas Grant see in that car that an entire auction house full of experts missed? The answer is worth $8 million, and it starts with a lesson his father taught him a long time ago. Lucas Grant loaded the last of his tools into the passenger footwell of his pickup at 6:45 on a Tuesday morning, checked the side mirror out of habit, and pulled out of the narrow Brooklyn street where his repair shop occupied the ground floor of a converted warehouse. The sky was that particular shade of pale gray that comes before the city fully wakes up, and the traffic on the bridge was still light enough that he could see the East River clearly below. Mia sat in the seat beside him, 6 years old. Her red fox stuffed animal, she called it, Rusty tucked firmly under one arm. She had her mother's habit of waking up completely alert. No groggy transition, just eyes open and already asking questions. "What's your favorite car in the whole world?" she asked, adjusting Rusty's ear with the focused seriousness of someone arranging something important. Lucas thought about it for a moment, the way he always thought about Mia's questions, not quickly, because she always knew when an answer was rushed. "A car nobody's looked at the right way yet," he said. She nodded as if this made complete sense. She settled back in the seat and watched the bridge cables pass overhead, and Lucas kept his eyes on the road. 3 years earlier, Lucas had been a chassis engineer with a small but respected Formula Heritage racing team, a position he had earned not through connections, but through the kind of obsessive mechanical knowledge that makes other engineers too uncomfortable at dinner, because the conversation only ever goes one place. His father, Raymond Grant, had spent 40 years documenting the history of American racing manufacturers, and his particular fixation had been Callaway Racing, a short-lived Detroit company that had produced some of the most technically sophisticated factory prototype cars of the early 1960s, before a warehouse fire in 1965 had reportedly destroyed most of what they built. Raymond had talked about the GTR-0 the way other fathers talked about legendary fish they'd almost caught. The only factory prototype, the first one off the line, gone, probably, but not certainly. Lucas had grown up with that story the way other children grow up with fairy tales. His mother, Claire, had died in a traffic accident when Mia was 3 years old, and Lucas had left the racing team 6 months later, not because he couldn't handle the work, but because a paddock in Monaco and a 6-year-old in Brooklyn are not compatible in the way that matters most. He opened the repair shop. He learned how to pack school lunches. He kept his father's research binders on a shelf above his workbench. Today he was driving to the Upper East Side for a morning preview at a Hartwell Prestige estate sale, the kind of event where old money's furniture and forgotten collections get cataloged and sold. He wasn't there for the Patek Philippe watches or the Impressionist oils. He was there for anything mechanical, anything overlooked, anything in the back of the catalog that the main bidders would ignore. He parked the truck 2 blocks from the address, signed Mia into the complimentary care room that Hartwell provided near the main entrance, a small room with beanbag chairs and a television playing cartoons, kissed the top of her head, and walked through the tall front doors of the venue with his flashlight in his jacket pocket and his father's voice somewhere behind his eyes. The main hall was high-ceilinged and already crowded with preview guests, all of them moving with the particular confidence of people accustomed to being in rooms where expensive things are displayed. Lucas moved along the edges, reading the lot tags methodically, pausing at a set of vintage tire-changing equipment and a crated collection of dashboard gauges from the 1950s. And then he turned the corner near the back wall and stopped. The car was pushed against the wall between 2 storage racks of framed artwork, half blocked by a rolling equipment cart, positioned as though whoever had placed it there had been actively trying to keep it out of the way. The paint, a dull olive green, was not original, not by decades. The bodywork was wrong for any production model he recognized, modified or partially stripped, the fender lines altered. But underneath all of that, visible only if you knew precisely where to look, the proportions of the roofline were unusual in a very specific way. Lucas crouched down and turned on his flashlight. He was still crouched there, angled beneath the driver's side door, when he heard footsteps stop nearby. He looked up. Giselle Hartwell was watching him with an expression that combined mild curiosity and something closer to impatience, the look of someone interrupted by a problem they didn't ask for. She was wearing a charcoal suit that had probably cost more than Lucas's monthly shop rent, and her junior appraiser, a younger woman with a clipboard, who Lucas would later learn was named Diana Walsh, stood a half-step behind her. Giselle looked at the car, then at Lucas, then at the car again, with the brief, efficient appraisal of someone who has already decided. "This lot has no real value," she said, her voice carrying cleanly in the high-ceilinged room. "It's here as a courtesy to the estate family. We didn't want to refuse them." She paused, letting the silence settle, then added, with a small precision that landed exactly where she intended it to, "I'm not sure this preview is the right fit for certain budget ranges." A few of the other preview guests nearby glanced over. One or two almost smiled. Lucas did not stand up immediately. He looked at the car for another 2 seconds, the flashlight still in his hand, and then he stood and met Giselle's eyes without any particular expression. "Thank you for letting me know," he said. She moved on. Lucas turned back to the car and looked at the firewall through the gap behind the fender. Diana Walsh lingered for a moment, not obviously, just a beat longer than she needed to, and when Lucas glanced at her, she looked away first. A man in a black suit appeared briefly at the edge of the hall. Heavy set, Rolex on the wrist, the easy movement of someone who spent a great deal of time in rooms like this and had stopped noticing them years ago. He was Jason Cole, a mid-level collector and dealer who had been buying and flipping specialty automotive lots for 2 decades. He looked at Lot 47 with the quick, practiced glance of someone sorting through a bin for something worth saving, found nothing that interested him, and moved on. Through the doorway to the care room, Lucas could see Mia standing at the threshold, Rusty under her arm, looking out at him. He gave her a small nod. She disappeared back inside. Lucas pocketed the flashlight and walked to the registration desk. The bidding room filled to about 60% capacity for the main session, and it thinned considerably. After the marquee lots, a collection of estate jewelry, and 2 significant paintings cleared in the first 40 minutes. Lot 47 was called near the end of the session, after the crowd had redistributed into smaller clusters of people checking their phones and finishing their coffee. The auctioneer, a Hartwell staff member filling in for the final stretch, announced it with the same brisk, neutral tone used for everything else. Asterisk, Lot 47, automotive item, estimated 5,000 to 8,000, sold as is, no warranty, no reserve, bidding opens at 3,000. Asterisk. 3,000 became 5,000 in the first 30 seconds, which surprised nobody. And then the room went quiet again, the way rooms go quiet when nobody particularly wants something. Lucas raised his paddle at 8,000. Jason Cole, positioned in a far corner with his arms crossed, noticed the bid and looked across the room for the first time with genuine attention. He raised his own paddle, 9,000, with the automatic reflex of a man who dislikes losing to anyone, even things he doesn't actually want. Lucas, 11,000. Jason Cole studied him across the room, the work jacket, the careful posture, the way the man was watching the car rather than the auctioneer, and then he set his paddle down on the armrest. "Not worth it," his expression said. "Whatever this is, it isn't worth a bidding war." The gavel came down. Diana Walsh was handling the paperwork at the side table, and she slid the bill of sale across the counter without making it obvious that she was watching Lucas's face. "What did you see in it?" she asked, quiet enough that it wouldn't carry. Lucas signed his name on the line. "I'm not certain yet," he said, "but I think I'll know by the end of the week." Mia was waiting by the main entrance with a volunteer, Rusty on her shoulder, watching the loading crew attach the small crane hook to the car's chassis. "It's really dirty," she said when Lucas glanced in the rearview mirror at the car, now secured on the flatbed behind them, and drove back across the bridge toward Brooklyn. He worked alone in the shop that first night after Mia was asleep. The overhead LED bars turned the space a clean, shadowless white, and Lucas moved around the car in a slow, outward-in pattern, the same approach his father had always used, starting with the body and working toward what the body was hiding. The welds on the inner structure were the first thing. Not amateur work, not production line automation. These were hand-applied spot welds with a distinctive spacing pattern that dated to a specific period and a specific tier of fabrication. Professional race team construction, circa early 1960s. He photographed everything with his phone, each frame composed carefully enough that the resolution would hold under magnification. He worked without music, which was his habit when something required the kind of concentration that sound interrupted. He opened the hood. The engine block sat in the bay with the quiet authority of something that had been built to do one specific thing extremely well. He angled the flashlight toward the left face of the block, the inner surface, the one most people ignored because it faced the firewall and required you to essentially put your head inside the engine bay to see it. The casting mark was there, pressed into the iron in raised numerals. 03-1963, March, 1963. Lucas did not make a sound. He held the light steady and read the mark 3 times. His father had described this mark in an audio recording that Lucas had transferred to his phone years ago and listened to so many times he could recite it from memory. Asterisk. If you ever find a block cast in March of '63 with the CGT prefix on the chassis, you look for the chassis plate immediately. Don't stop for anything. Asterisk. He withdrew his head from the engine bay, stood up straight, and for a moment he simply breathed. The chassis plate in the standard location had been removed. The mounting holes were there, slightly darkened with age, the thread pattern intact but empty. This was not unusual for a car that had passed through many hands over 60 years. What mattered was the secondary location. Factory race cars of that era almost always had a backup identification point, a fallback stamp applied by the build team, placed somewhere inconvenient enough that a casual disassembly would miss it. Lucas removed the glove compartment housing 4 screws, a 10-minute job, and reached into the recess behind it with a handheld lamp. The stamp was there, cut directly into the frame rail. 6 characters. CGTR001. He sat down on the shop floor with his back against the rear wheel and stayed there for a while. CGTR001. The chassis number of the Callaway GTR-0, the only one ever built. The car that the historical record said had burned in the Callaway Racing warehouse fire on the 14th of November, 1965. He got up, went back to the firewall, and checked the third thing. Behind the engine bay, pressed between the 2 layers of the firewall structure, a hand-welded reinforcement bar ran diagonally across the upper section. The weld angle was not perfectly symmetrical. It was not meant to be. It was the deliberate signature of a craftsman who worked by feel rather than jig approximately 73 degrees of angle, a habit so individual. It had been documented in a single technical history paper published 30 years ago by the National Automotive History Institute. The paper's author had described the technique as belonging exclusively to one man, chief fabricator Arthur J. Webb, who had hand-welded every Callaway factory prototype from 1962 through 1965. Mia appeared at the shop doorway at 3 in the morning, her hair uncombed, Rusty hanging from one hand, bare feet on the concrete step. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I'm fine," Lucas said. "Go back to sleep." She looked at him, then at the car, with the evaluating gaze that children deploy when they suspect adults are underreporting. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Lucas looked at the car for a long moment. "I think I might have," he said. She padded back to bed. He reached for his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in 2 years. Dr. Samuel Webb was 72 years old, retired from the directorship of the National Automotive History Institute, and the only living authority on Callaway Racing's factory operations. He was also the son of Arthur J. Webb. Lucas had met him twice in person, once as a child, when his father had brought him to a conference in Detroit, and once as an adult, when Lucas was still with the racing team and Dr. Webb had come to authenticate a set of period documents. When Lucas called at 8 in the morning on the third day, he did not explain the full situation. He simply read 3 pieces of information from his notes. *03, 1963, Chi GTR 001. Hand-welded firewall bar, approximately 73 degrees. *. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Lucas checked to see if the call had dropped. Then Dr. Webb said, in a voice that had become very quiet and very careful, "Send me photographs. Every photograph you have. Right now." Lucas sent 47 images. 2 hours later, Dr. Webb called back on video. He had a colleague with him, a German academic, named Dr. Hoffman, one of the few surviving researchers who had worked directly with original Callaway factory records in the 1990s. Dr. Hoffman went through the photographs one by one, without speaking for close to 20 minutes. When he finally did speak, it was in accented but precise English, and he addressed his first comment not to Lucas, but to the image of the firewall bar on the screen in front of him. "The weld," he said, 73 degrees. "This is Arthur's technique." Dr. Webb translated the weight of that, though it needed no translation. "My father welded this car." There was a silence in the call that was different from ordinary silence, the kind that comes when something long believed impossible turns out to be simply unlikely, which is a different category entirely. Dr. Webb looked at Lucas through the screen and spoke directly. "If the engine is original, unmolested, unreplaced, and if the chassis stamp is what you say it is, then what you have is the GTR-0, the only one. There is no second car. The fire destroyed the records and the components, but not the car." Lucas asked the question that needed asking. "Estimated value?" Dr. Webb was quiet for a moment. "We need formal authentication before anyone says a number. But speaking conservatively about the current market for factory prototype race cars of this significance, I would say 7 to 9 million is a careful estimate. It could go higher." Lucas ended the call. He set the phone face down on the workbench and stood at the shop window looking out at the narrow street. Across the sidewalk, Mia was in the small fenced yard beside the shop building, walking Rusty along the top of the fence railing with great concentration, narrating a story to herself in a voice too low to hear. Lucas watched her for a long time. Then he turned back to the shop and began preparing the car for a more thorough inspection. The black SUV appeared outside the shop at 9 in the morning on the 5th day. Lucas saw it from the second-floor window, while he was making coffee idling engine, tinted glass, the specific quality of stillness that belongs to a vehicle waiting for its driver to do something rather than go somewhere. Jason Cole came through the front door without knocking, which was not a surprise because men like Jason Cole did not knock on the doors of repair shops. He had a young attorney with him, briefcase, expensive haircut, the slightly rigid bearing of someone who had been told this would be a short meeting. Jason looked at the shop, the tools hung on pegboard, the lift hydraulics, the calendar from a parts supplier on the wall, with an expression that managed to be simultaneously unimpressed and calculating. "You bought a car at the Hartwell session 2 days ago," he said. "I bought a car," Lucas confirmed. "Everything processed correctly. I have the paperwork." Jason smiled with one side of his mouth. "I'm not here about the paperwork. I want to buy it back from you." The attorney placed an open folder on Lucas's workbench. A contract already prepared. A number printed in bold at the top, $200,000. Wire transfer. Same day. Lucas did not look at the folder. "No," he said. Jason paused in the way of a man unaccustomed to that word being the first and only one offered. "You paid $11,500. I'm offering $200,000. That's a reasonable offer." "No," Lucas said again, the same way. Jason's expression shifted into something more deliberate, the social smile replaced by the face he presumably wore in negotiations he expected to win. "The estate family has their own attorneys looking at the terms of the original sale. There may be a question about whether items of exceptional undisclosed value were properly represented in the estate inventory." The attorney shifted his weight slightly, which told Lucas that this particular argument had some technical merit and some significant gaps. "The lot was sold as is. No warranty, no representation of value," Lucas said. Hartwell Prestige made no claims about the car in either direction. I reviewed the sale terms before I placed a bid. The purchase is legally complete. The attorney's slight shift became a slight stillness, which was more informative. Jason studied Lucas for a moment with the recalibrating attention of someone who had expected a shorter conversation. Mia appeared in the interior doorway connecting the shop to the stairwell, Rusty under her arm, looking at the unfamiliar man with the frank curiosity of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't looking. Jason glanced at her, then back at Lucas, and when he looked at Lucas again, something in his expression had changed. A new calculation, a different kind of leverage being considered. Lucas did not look at Mia. 300,000, Jason said. Final. Lucas turned his head toward the doorway. Mia, he said very calmly, go upstairs, please. When the sound of her footsteps had faded on the stairs, Lucas looked at Jason Cole and said, in a voice that was quiet and completely even, you should get in your car and leave before I call my attorney. Jason Cole left. He paused at the door and turned back once not to speak, just to look at the car on the lift, still in its olive green paint, still battered and dusty and, to any eye but the right one, entirely worthless. His expression was not the expression of a man who had given up. Lucas watched the SUV pull away, picked up his phone, and called Dr. Webb. We need to move faster, he said. Dr. Samuel Webb drove down from Boston the next morning, in his old Volvo, arriving at the Brooklyn shop at 10 o'clock, with a leather document case under one arm and a 35mm film camera in a canvas bag over his shoulder. He parked at the curb, came through the open roll-up door, and stopped just inside, looking at the car from 15 feet away, as still as someone who has waited a very long time for something and is not sure yet whether it is what they hoped. He set his bags down and approached slowly, the way you approach something fragile, not because the car was fragile, but because the moment was. He crouched beside the engine bay, and when he pressed his palm flat against the diagonal weld bar on the firewall, his voice was low and not quite steady. This is my father's weld. He was not talking to Lucas. He was talking to the metal, or to a version of the room that existed some 60 years before the present one. The authentication took 3 hours. Dr. Webb worked with the methodical patience of a man who had spent 50 years doing this, photographing everything on film. He did not trust digital for records of this significance, and cross-referencing each finding against documents he had brought in the leather case. Original Callaway factory blueprints, his father's hand-annotated build logs, a fragmentary set of supplier invoices from 1962 and 63. The chassis stamp matched. The block casting date matched. The weld geometry matched. And then Dr. Webb found something that even Lucas had not found, because it required knowing specifically where to look and why it might be there. Tucked into a narrow recess along the inner dash rail, clipped to the frame steel with a small metal fastener, was a cylinder of thin plastic housing, the kind of improvised preservation case that a careful man might construct from materials available in a factory tool room. Inside the cylinder, rolled around a short wooden dowel, was a single sheet of paper. It was a build sheet, a factory production record dated the 31st of March, 1963. Chassis designation, CGT Air 00UN. Engine designation, CBRV 8003. Sign-off line at the bottom. Asterisk A.J. Webb, Senior Fabricator. Asterisk. The handwriting was the compact, left-leaning cursive of someone who had written production notes in the margins of blueprints for 30 years. Dr. Webb held the paper in both hands without speaking for a very long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red. He hid it here, he said. He knew the car wouldn't be burned. He hid the proof. Lucas stood at the doorway of the shop, his hands in his pockets, the late afternoon light coming in at an angle across the floor. Mia had come down from upstairs and was standing beside him, her small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers, watching the old man at the workbench with the gravity of a child who understands that something important is happening, even if she cannot name it. By 5 o'clock, Dr. Webb had signed and notarized the formal authentication certificate. The document stated, in the precise and unambiguous language of someone who had spent a career preparing to write exactly this sentence, that the vehicle bearing chassis number CGTR 001, engine casting dated March 1963, and factory build sheet signed by Arthur J. Webb, was the Callaway GTR 0 factory prototype, the only surviving example, and that its estimated fair market value in the current collector automobile market fell between $7,500,000 and $9 million, with potential for a higher realized price at auction, given the historical uniqueness of the piece. Dr. Webb shook Lucas's hand at the front door, holding it for a moment before letting go. "How did you find it?" he asked. Lucas glanced down at Mia, who was leaning against the doorframe, Rusty balanced on top of her head. "My father taught me how to look," Lucas said. Dr. Webb nodded, got in his Volvo, and drove north into the early evening. Lucas went inside and called the main line for Hartwell Prestige Auctions. The call was transferred twice before reaching Giselle Hartwell directly, which was unusual for an unsolicited inbound. She answered with the practiced efficiency of someone managing a dense schedule, and Lucas said what needed to be said without preamble. He owned the Callaway GTR 0. It had been formally authenticated by Dr. Samuel Webb, and he wanted to sell it through Hartwell Prestige in a dedicated single-lot auction. There was a silence on the line that was different from the processing pauses of normal business conversation, longer, and shaped differently, the silence of someone rearranging a mental picture rather than retrieving information. "Lot 47?" Giselle said. "Yes," Lucas said. Another silence. "I'll need to see the authentication documents. Dr. Webb is available for a direct call if you need it." There was the sound of something being set down carefully on a hard surface. "We'll schedule a special session," she said. "Friday. We'll handle all the preparation on our end." Her voice had retained its professional precision, but had shed something else, a particular quality of controlled authority that had been present in every previous exchange, the vocal equivalent of looking at someone from a height. Lucas said thank you, and ended the call. That evening, Mia sat on the high stool beside his workbench while he worked on a 1968 muscle car that had nothing remarkable about it except that it ran and its owner needed it back by the following week. "Are you selling the dirty car?" she asked. "Yes," Lucas said, not looking up from the carburetor he was rebuilding. "Why? You just got it." Lucas set down the float and thought about how to answer in a way that was true and small enough to carry. "Because some things don't belong in just one person's shop," he said. Mia considered this, turning Rusty over in her hands. "Like a library book," she said. Lucas looked at her. "Exactly like a library book," he said. She seemed satisfied with that. She watched him work until her eyes started closing, and then he carried her upstairs without waking her, pulled the blanket up, and went back down to finish the carburetor. Hartwell Prestige sent the press release at 8 on Friday morning. Asterisk special single, lot session, 1963. Callaway GT, R0, sole surviving factory prototype, authenticated by Dr. W. Samuel Webb, asterisk. By 10 o'clock, 3 international automotive history publications had picked up the announcement. 12 international bidders had registered for remote access. The main bidding room at the Hartwell venue had more people in it by 11:30 than it typically saw at its flagship spring sales. Lucas drove across the bridge in the same pickup, Mia beside him in a navy dress with Rusty on her lap. He wore a white button-down shirt and dark trousers, no suit, no tie, nothing that would have made him unrecognizable to anyone who had seen him 3 days earlier in a work jacket crouching beside a car nobody wanted. He parked, took Mia's hand, and walked through the main entrance. People looked, not because of what he was wearing, but because his name was at the top of the press release and a few of the collectors and dealers in the lobby had the particular alertness of people who have recently recalibrated an assumption. Diana Walsh met them at the main door with 2 access cards. She looked at Mia with genuine warmth. "What's your name?" she asked, crouching slightly to meet the child's eye level. "Mia," the girl said. "And this is Rusty." Diana smiled the kind of smile that belongs to a person rather than a professional role and led them to the seller's waiting area, a quiet room off the main hall with upholstered chairs and a window overlooking the street. Jason Cole was already in the bidding room when Lucas walked through before the session began. Seated in the second row, arms folded, jaw set in the particular expression of a man who has decided he can still salvage something from a situation that has moved against him. He had registered to bid. Lucas noted this and said nothing about it. Dr. Webb was in the front row, his leather document case on the seat beside him, watching the car, which had been brought in on a low platform, cleaned carefully, but not restored. Every original surface intact and honest, with the patient attention of someone sitting with a very old friend. Giselle Hartwell stepped up to the podium. The room quieted. She introduced the lot with the precise historical language that the authentication documents provided, reading from notes she had clearly prepared carefully, and then she opened the bidding at $2 million. $2 million became $4 million in the first 15 seconds, 3 international phone bidders coming in simultaneously from the remote lines. $4 million became $5,800,000 before 30 seconds had elapsed. Jason Cole raised his paddle at $6 million, and the figure climbed past him. $6.5 million from a Japanese collector on screen, $7 million from Cole, $7.8 million from the screen. Cole, $8 million. The screen went quiet. Giselle looked out over the room, her voice steady. $8 million, going once. No movement from the screens. Lucas was standing at the side of the room, near the wall, one hand resting on Mia's shoulder. She didn't understand the numbers, they were too large, too abstract, outside the scale of anything in her daily life. But she was watching her father's face and reading what was there with the acuity that children develop when they have learned to pay close attention to the adults they depend on. 8 million, going twice. The room held its breath. The gavel came down. Sold. $8,200,000. The room released applause, the murmur of voices, the soft percussion of phones being raised. Jason Cole stood, buttoned his jacket without looking at anyone, and walked out through the side door with the unhurried gait of a man managing a defeat in public. Dr. Webb did not stand. He sat in the front row and looked at the car on the platform with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes gone bright and wet. Lucas looked down at Mia. She looked up at him. She didn't ask about the number. She held Rusty tighter with one arm and put her other hand into his. Diana Walsh took Mia to the small lounge near the side corridor with a tablet loaded with cartoons, and Mia went willingly. Rusty already settled on the armrest beside her before the door was halfway closed. Giselle Hartwell found Lucas in the hallway, outside the main room, not the imposing corridor of the front entrance, but the quieter passage that led to the administrative offices, where the ceiling was lower and the lighting was warmer, and there was nothing to perform for. She came alone. No clipboard, no assistant, no the practiced composure that typically accompanied her public movements. She stood across from him, with the posture of someone making a deliberate effort at something, and when she said his name, it was without the particular inflection that comes from holding a position of advantage. Lucas Grant. He waited. "What did you see in that car?" she asked. Not the rhetorical version of the question, the real one. He considered her for a moment. "The firewall reinforcement bar," he said. "The weld angle. 73 degrees, the signature of a specific fabricator. You saw that when you were crouching beside it on Tuesday morning?" "I saw it in the preview photographs that were sent to registered attendees the week before. I was already suspicious when I walked through the door. I needed to confirm it in person." She was quiet for a moment, and he watched something move through her expression. Not the managed shift of someone adjusting their professional position, but the involuntary rearrangement of someone processing the specific weight of what they did. "I said what I said in front of a lot of people," she said. "Not an apology yet. A statement, offered precisely." "You did," Lucas said. She looked at him steadily. "Your daughter was there. Mia's seen a lot of things," Lucas said, and his voice was neither forgiving nor hard, simply honest, the way very few people are when they have something to forgive and choose not to make theater of it. "She knows that being right doesn't mean people will believe you right away. She's learning, that's okay." Giselle held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. "Your father, what did he do?" "He passed away 4 years ago. He was an engineer. He spent most of his life looking at things other people had stopped looking at. And you?" He glanced toward the lounge door where Mia was. "I love my daughter," he said simply. "The cars are how I take care of that the right way." Giselle stood for a moment in the particular stillness of someone who has just heard something that requires no response and knows it. "I'll send a formal letter of apology on Monday," she said. "That's not necessary," Lucas said. Not cold, not performed magnanimity either. Just the statement of a man who decided on Tuesday morning, crouching in a dusty hall, that he had no use for other people's opinions of what he could see. But if you want to send it, that's your decision to make. He gave her a small, neutral nod and turned to collect his daughter. 2 weeks passed. Lucas did not move the shop, did not buy a new truck, did not hire a new sign for the front of the building. He opened a trust account for Mia at the credit union 3 blocks away, a significant sum, set aside in a structure that would give her options when she was old enough to need them and have no strings attached to any of them. He kept the remainder in a business account and made plans to expand the shop by 1 bay, which would allow him to take on a second mechanic and stop working every Saturday alone. Nothing about the outside of the building changed. The same parts supplier calendar was still on the wall. The same coffee maker with the cracked handle sat on the same shelf. Dr. Webb came by one last time before returning to Boston, pulling up in the Volvo with a flat package under his arm. Inside was an old black and white photograph factory floor, 1963, 2 men standing beside a car that was unmistakably the GTR-0 in its original racing configuration, the bodywork intact and perfect. One of the men was Arthur Webb, younger than Lucas had ever imagined him, squinting slightly in the factory lighting. Dr. Webb had written on the back, in the same compact, left-leaning cursive as his father, asterisk, "To the man who found what my father left behind, asterisk." Lucas hung it on the wall above his workbench, between a wiring diagram for a 1972 coupe and a photograph of his own father standing in front of a race car in a Detroit paddock sometime in the early 1990s. On a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks after the sale, Lucas was on his back, under the 1968 muscle car, the unremarkable one, the one whose owner just needed it running when Mia climbed onto the high stool and began arranging Rusty on the top of the tool chest with architectural precision. "What are you doing today?" she asked, the way she always asked, as though the answer would determine something important. "Looking at a car," Lucas said from under the chassis. "Is it a good one?" "I don't know yet. I'm still looking." She thought about this. "Like the dirty one," she said. "Like the dirty one," he agreed. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to Rusty's arrangement. That evening, while he was locking up the shop, his phone buzzed on the workbench. A text from an unfamiliar number, though the initials at the bottom identified the sender without ambiguity. Asterisk, "I want to apologize for what I said that morning. Not because of what the car turned out to be, because I judged before I looked, and I know now what that cost, and what it could have cost. G.H. Asterisk." Lucas read it once, then a second time. He typed a reply, asterisk, "Thank you for writing this. L.A.G. Asterisk." He set the phone down on the bench, turned off the overhead lights, and stood for a moment in the dark of the shop before heading upstairs. Through the single window above the workbench, the streetlight outside threw a long rectangle across the floor, and in it, the 1968 muscle car sat on the lift. Nothing special, nothing hidden, just a car that needed work. He looked at it for a moment anyway. Habit, the habit his father had given him, the habit of looking at ordinary things long enough and carefully enough that ordinary, sometimes, turns out to be something else entirely. There are things people walk past because there is no obvious reason to stop. There are things that sit in the back of rooms, tagged and priced and largely ignored, waiting for the one person in the room who knows where to look and why. Most people never meet that person, and that person quiet, unhurried, wrong by the world's first accounting, and right by everyone that follows almost never announces themselves. They just crouch down in the back of a hall with a small flashlight, look at the undercarriage of a car that everyone else has written off, and see what no one else took the time to find. Not because they were lucky, because someone, a long time ago, taught them how to look.